way, quickly!
From deserts to cities, from secrets to love, every border hides a story.
Comment below which country you're watching from. Make sure you're subscribed. Enjoy. The princess ran like her life depended on it. Her designer heels abandoned 2 corridors back, her carefully pinned hair coming loose as she descended the narrow service stairs toward the yacht's lower galley. Behind her, voices echoed through the marble hallways, calling her formal name, searching for the crown jewel that had slipped away from yet another state dinner rehearsal. She did not slow down. The kitchen door swung open, and she stumbled into a different world entirely. A man stood at the central station, grinding something against hot stone, his movements rhythmic and deliberate, his lips moving in silent words she could not understand. He did not look up when she entered, did not acknowledge her presence, and that indifference felt more respectful than any bow she had ever received. Elena caught her breath and watched him work. His knuckles moved in perfect circles, crushing dried peppers, the scent rising from his station cut through the air sharp and holy, nothing like the mild seasonings she had eaten her entire life. She found herself moving closer without deciding to, drawn by something she could not name but desperately needed. The man finally looked up, and his eyes held no recognition, no deference, just mild curiosity about why someone in expensive clothes was standing in his kitchen, breathing like she had been running from danger. Kofi Asedu saw a young woman who looked simultaneously wealthy and desperate, beautiful in an exhausted way that suggested her beauty had become a burden. He asked what she wanted, and his voice carried an accent that wrapped around English words. Elena asked what he was making, and the question came out more vulnerable than she intended. Kofi told her he was preparing Kellerwell base, that the pepper needed exactly 7 minutes of grinding to wake its soul, that most people rushed this step and ended up with anger instead of joy in their food. She did not understand what he meant, but wanted it with a hunger that had nothing to do with her stomach and everything to do with the emptiness that had been growing in her chest for years. She asked if she could try. Kofi almost refused, seeing her soft hands and expensive dress, but something in her eyes stopped him. Desperation, but not the soft kind that came from boredom. This was the hard desperation of someone drowning. He stepped aside and gestured to the stone, and Elena positioned her hands completely wrong, holding tension in her shoulders like armor she had forgotten she was wearing. Kofi corrected her without ceremony, his hand briefly guiding her wrist into the proper circle. Elena flinched at the touch before forcing herself still, and in that moment Kofi understood she was someone who had been handled all her life but never truly touched. They ground pepper together in silence, her rhythm terrible at first, fighting the stone instead of partnering with it. But slowly something shifted, her shoulders dropped, her breathing steadied. The pepper began to release its scent properly. When Elena opened her eyes again, they were wet with tears she could not explain. She told him she had never been touched like that before. Everyone else in her life touched her like she was made of glass or gold or some substance that required gloves and distance. Kofi heard the peculiar shame in her voice, the poverty that money could never fix, and understood she was running from something larger than a dinner rehearsal. He asked her name. She hesitated, then said Eleanor, just Eleanor, and he heard the partial truth in her answer, but respected it. In Ghana, people often gave strangers their middle names first, keeping their full names safe until trust was earned. He told her his complete name, Kofi Asedu, named for Friday and his grandfather's courage, and watched her mouth work carefully around the unfamiliar sounds, like they were something precious. Footsteps thundered on the stairs above them, multiple pairs moving with military precision. Eleanor's face went white. She grabbed Kofi's arm with surprising strength and asked him to lie, to say she had been helping him prepare vegetables, to please not tell them she had run away. Before Kofi could respond, the kitchen door burst open and 3 men in dark suits entered, followed by a thin woman whose face looked carved from permanent disapproval. They demanded to know if he had seen Princess Elena von Helsen. The world tilted sideways as Kofi understood exactly who was gripping his arm, but he had already decided to lie before his mind caught up with his mouth. He told them a young woman had been asking about kitchen procedures but had left through the service corridor 10 minutes ago. The thin woman's eyes narrowed with suspicion that cut like wire, but she had no evidence to contradict him. They swept out like a reversed storm. Elena released his arm slowly, leaving white marks where her fingers had pressed. She told him he should not have done that lying to the royal household was a dismissible offense, possibly worse. Kofi shrugged and returned to his pepper, which had gone cold and needed restarting. He told her that in his culture, hospitality was sacred, and anyone who came to your fire seeking shelter deserved protection, even from their own people. She stood watching him begin the grinding process again, and something shifted in her face like a wall developing its first crack. She said she would return tomorrow if he would let her, that she needed to learn about fire that spoke truth instead of fire that only ever did what it was told. Kofi did not look up from his work, but told her the kitchen opened at dawn, and anyone who wanted to learn was welcome, princess or prisoner or anything in between. Elena left through the service corridor he had lied about, and Kofi ground pepper for another hour, trying to process what had happened. He had come to this yacht to prove African cuisine belonged at the highest tables in the world, to show that his grandmother's recipes carried the same sophistication as French technique. He had not come to get entangled with royalty, especially not royalty that looked at him like he was the first person who had ever seen her as human. But the pepper in his mortar had taken on a strange quality, something he had only achieved a handful of times in his career. It smelled like longing and transformation, like smoke from fires that changed people's lives. His grandmother would have called it an omen. Kofi called it trouble and continued grinding, because what else could a man do when destiny arrived in his kitchen wearing the wrong clothes and asking the right questions? The knife slipped, and blood bloomed across Elena's palm before she could stop it, bright red against her pale skin. She gasped, but did not cry out, watching the wound with strange fascination, while Kofi moved quickly to grab clean towels and his first aid kit. This was her fourth morning in the kitchen and her first real injury, payment for her wandering attention while chopping vegetables. She had been thinking about Prince Henrik's arrival in 2 days, instead of focusing on the plantains in front of her. Kofi wrapped her hand with efficient gentleness, and Eleanor noticed how different his touch felt now compared to that first night. He had stopped treating her carefully, had begun correcting her mistakes with the same bluntness he probably used with any kitchen apprentice. It felt like respect, this willingness to let her fail and bleed and learn from consequences. She apologized for wasting his time and his supplies, but Kofi told her that anyone who cooked seriously would eventually bleed, that kitchen scars were marks of genuine learning rather than shame. He returned her to a different task, one that required less sharp implements, and Eleanor found herself peeling boiled cassava for fufu, while Kofi worked on breaking down a whole goat nearby. His knife moved through joints with ceremonial precision, and he explained without being asked that his uncle had taught him to honor every animal's sacrifice by using every part, wasting nothing, treating death with the respect it deserved. Eleanor thought about how her own life felt like waste, all her potential and education and privilege directed toward nothing except existing beautifully beside a man she had met 4 times. She asked Kofi if he had ever felt trapped by expectations, and he paused in his butchering to consider the question properly. He told her about the pressure from his family when he had chosen cooking over university, how his father had called it women's work, how his mother had worried he would never achieve stability or respect. But his grandmother had defended him, had taught him that feeding people was sacred work regardless of gender, that every culture's survival depended on someone caring enough to preserve its food traditions. Elena worked the cassava with increasing frustration, her wrapped hand making the task awkward, and finally she stopped and asked the question that had been burning in her chest for days. She asked him how he had found the courage to disappoint his family, to choose his own path when everyone expected something different. Kofi set down his knife and looked at her directly, and his answer came slow and careful, like he was grinding pepper properly instead of rushing. He told her that courage was not something you found. It was something you practiced in small moments until it became strong enough for large ones. Every time he had chosen his own direction, despite pressure, despite fear, despite reasonable arguments for the safer path, he had built the muscle that eventually let him pursue cooking professionally. But he also told her that his choices had been easier because he was a man, because his family could eventually accept his unconventional career once he started winning awards, because the world punished women for wanting freedom far more severely than it punished men. Elena felt tears starting and forced them back, returning to the cassava with renewed focus. She told him about Prince Henrik's impending arrival, about the formal engagement announcement scheduled for the gala in 3 days, about how her mother had already selected her wedding dress and the names of her future children. The tracks of her life extended forward in perfect straight lines, and nowhere in those plans was there room for cassava peeling or pepper grinding, or any moment where she got to choose her own direction. Kofi abandoned his station and brought her to the stove where 3 different pots simmered with palm oil bases. He told her that West African cooking was about layering flavors through time and temperature, that you could not rush the conversation between ingredients or the food would taste like an argument. He taught her to listen to the sound of the oil, watch how the smoke moved, smell the exact moment when vegetables gave up their bitterness and accepted their sweetness. Eleanor stirred one of the pots under his guidance and felt something break open in her chest. She had never felt useful before, had never created anything that mattered, had never been trusted with work that required real attention and skill. Her entire existence had been decorative, symbolic, a chess piece other people moved to mean things she had no control over. Even her education had been carefully curated to make her interesting at dinner parties without giving her skills that might lead to actual independence. She asked Kofi what he would do if he were her, and he had to think about that while adjusting the fire under the groundnut soup he was preparing. He told her honestly that he did not know, that he could not imagine the specific pressures of her life, but that his grandmother had always said any tradition that crushed human souls in the name of preserving itself had become corrupted and needed challenging. But his grandmother had also died without the respectability she deserved, labeled a troublemaker her whole life, so maybe that advice was not worth much. Eleanor told him that she would rather be a troublemaker who felt alive than a respectable woman who felt dead inside, and Kofi recognized the sound of someone talking themselves toward a decision that terrified them. He wanted to encourage her and protect her simultaneously, torn between his belief in freedom and his understanding of how viciously the world punished women who reached for it. Instead, he taught her to make Shito sauce, the kind his aunt sold in Accra markets for almost nothing but which contained more complexity than European sauces that cost 10 times as much. The peppers roasted over open flame, and their smoke filled the galley thick enough to make breathing difficult. This sauce demanded a response, required presence, refused passivity. She asked if this was what freedom tasted like. Kofi did not know how to answer that question from someone who lived in palaces but had never chosen her own breakfast. Instead, he told her about Amma, a girl from his neighborhood who had loved him before his career consumed his life. She had wanted stability and family and a husband who came home at reasonable hours. He had wanted to revolutionize how the world saw African cuisine. They had hurt each other, trying to want different futures, and eventually she had married someone who could give her the life she deserved. Eleanor asked if he regretted choosing cooking over love, and Kofi had to pause over the tilapia he was cleaning because the answer felt complicated. He told her he regretted causing Amma pain, but could not regret following his purpose. Every person had something they were put on earth to do, and for him it was keeping his grandmother's wisdom alive through smoke and spice. But late at night in empty kitchens, he sometimes wondered what it would feel like to cook for someone who loved him rather than critics who analyzed him. Eleanor's time ran out and she had to leave. But before she did, she turned back and told him she would return tomorrow and every day until the voyage ended. That she needed this kitchen the way some people needed air. Kofi should have said no, should have protected himself from the obvious disaster this was becoming, but instead he repeated yesterday's words like they were a promise neither of them should be making. That night he served his Afro-fusion menu to the yacht's elite guests, and he poured everything into those plates. The guests praised him with enthusiasm that felt more like curiosity than appreciation, except for one blonde woman in an emerald dress who sat at the captain's table and ate every course like it was a prayer. She never looked directly at him, maintaining proper royal distance, but when she lifted her wine glass in a silent toast while others were distracted, Kofi felt something in his chest catch fire that had nothing to do with cooking and everything to do with the kind of trouble that changed lives forever. The storm that reveals the wave hit like a fist, and Eleanor flew across the wet corridor toward the black open door and the ocean beyond it, her scream lost in the storm's roar. Then strong hands caught her waist and yanked her back from death, and she crashed into Kofi's chest as they both went down hard on the flooded floor. The ship pitched violently, and crew members finally secured the blown door, cutting off the wind and spray, leaving sudden terrible quiet filled only with Elena's gasping and the pounding of Kofi's heart against her back. They had been cooking a hotor when the storm hit, when the yacht's alarm system started screaming and crew members ran past the galley, shouting about securing upper decks. Elena had followed Kofi toward the commotion instead of returning to her cabin, unable to hide while other people dealt with danger, needing to feel useful even as the ship bucked like a living thing, trying to throw them all into the sea. Now she was alive because of him, drenched and shaking, but alive. Kofi helped her sit up, and their faces were inches apart, his hands still on her shoulders, and that was when Elena saw them. Royal guards at the corridor's far end, the thin woman in navy blue, and Prince Henrik in expensive casual wear, looking like a catalogue model who had wandered into the wrong movie. They stared at the scene with various expressions of shock and fury, and Elena felt reality crash down harder than any wave. She pulled away from Kofi and stood on shaking legs, seawater streaming from her clothes. In that moment, she had to choose what happened next, and she made the choice before fear could stop her. She straightened her spine and smoothed her face into the blankness she had been trained to wear. But then she turned back to Kofi and told the guards to leave them alone for 1 minute, using the command voice she had spent years learning to project. It worked because she was still technically a princess giving orders. In their confusion about protocol, they actually stepped back. Elena knelt beside Kofi on the wet floor, and her voice dropped to a whisper only he could hear. She told him not to kneel when they took her away, not to apologize, not to treat her like she was fragile or lost. She asked him to go back to the kitchen and finish the ahotor they had started together, to complete the ritual even if she could not be there to eat it. She needed to know that somewhere in the world that dish existed, that someone had cooked her soul-calling meal and marked her as eternally unforgettable, even if her life was about to proceed along tracks she had not chosen. Then she stood and walked toward Prince Henrik and her handlers, with her head high, and Kofi watched her disappear around the corner like a ghost returning to its haunting grounds. The guards stayed behind and told Kofi in clipped voices that he was to return to his quarters immediately, that the head steward would speak with him in the morning about his immediate departure from the ship. They implied threats about immigration consequences and professional blacklisting if he tried to contact the princess. Kofi walked back to the kitchen on numb legs and found the ahotor still simmering on the stove, somehow undisturbed by chaos. He stood there for a long time trying to decide what to do, then made a choice that would alter his life's trajectory. He completed the ritual exactly as his grandmother had taught him, singing the prayers for transformation and unforgettable souls, preparing the dish for 2 people even though only one would eat it. The palm oil turned the perfect red gold that meant the ancestors were listening, and the smoke carried weight beyond simple cooking fumes. When the ahotor was finished, he plated it carefully in the proper bowl, added traditional garnishes of smoked fish and boiled eggs, and sat down alone in the empty kitchen to consume his portion. Each bite carried the taste of everything he had taught Eleanor and everything she had taught him about the different kinds of cages people built and inherited. It was the best version of the dish he had ever made, and he cried while eating it because he understood what his grandmother had meant about this recipe marking transformations. Something in him had transformed during these days of teaching someone who desperately needed to be taught. Eleanor was eternally unforgettable now, written into his soul's story as the person who reminded him that cooking was not just about preserving tradition or proving cultural worth, but about feeding hungry hearts whatever food they most needed. He left Eleanor's portion covered on the counter with a note that simply said, "For the woman who learned to taste freedom." He did not expect it to reach her, expected the guards would throw it away, but he needed to complete the ritual regardless of outcome. Then he cleaned his station with methodical care, packed his knives and spices, and waited in his quarters for morning and whatever consequences were coming. Sleep felt impossible, so he sat in darkness, thinking about Elena facing her family's fury, wondering if she was strong enough to survive the pressure they would bring to bear. Just before dawn, someone knocked softly on his door. When Kofi opened it, he found the plate sitting on the floor completely empty and licked clean, with an engagement ring placed carefully in the center where food had been. A small note in elegant handwriting read, "I ate every bite. I tasted truth. Today, at the engagement announcement, I will make a choice. Thank you for teaching me that choosing is possible." Kofi picked up the ring and the plate with shaking hands. The diamond caught early light and scattered it into colors he had no names for, and he understood this small circle of metal and stone represented Eleanor's entire future, everything her family and nation expected her to become. She had removed it and sent it to him like she was sending back a life that had never truly belonged to her. He did not know if she would actually be able to resist the enormous pressure, did not know if he would be blacklisted from cooking professionally again, did not know if they would ever speak another word to each other. The ship's engines changed pitch as they approached port, and Kofi knew that in a few hours he would be escorted off this yacht and back to whatever life waited for him in Ghana. His time as Africa's representative chef on this royal voyage was ending in scandal rather than triumph. But she knew that regardless of what happened, she would never forget the man who had taught her that freedom tasted like smoke and fire and honest pain. She would never forget the feeling of her hands creating something real and useful. She would never forget that for a few mornings in a kitchen far below the world she was supposed to inhabit, she had been just Eleanor, learning and bleeding and choosing, and that version of herself was worth fighting for, even if the fight destroyed everything else. The sun climbed higher, and both of them stood in different parts of the ship, preparing for the moment when Eleanor's choice would become visible to the world. And whatever that choice turned out to be, they both knew that the fire between them had already transformed them both into people who could never return to who they had been before smoke and spice and sacred recipes had taught them what hunger really meant. Comment below which country you're watching from. Make sure you're subscribed.